The man who was now master of her house did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His power was absolute, written on the deed he held in one hand and in the cold, flat finality of his eyes. He stood in the entryway her grandfather had built, under the heavy oak lintel, hewn from a tree felled on their own land, and explained the situation to Alara as if she were a clerk being given her weekly figures. Her mother was gone. The house was his. Her presence was a complication to be resolved. "You will have until Friday," he said, his voice as dry as old paper. "The new owners wish to take possession on Monday. They are a good family from the city. They appreciate the history." He said the word history as if it were a commodity, something to be priced and sold, not lived and breathed. He slid a small envelope across the polished surface of the hall table, the same table where her grandfather had taught her to read the grain of a piece of wood, to understand its stresses and its strengths. "This should be sufficient for your arrangements." Alara did not look at the envelope. She looked at his hands. They were soft, unused hands, the hands of a man who moved money, not stone or timber. They were nothing like her grandfather's hands, which had been a landscape of scars, calluses, and ingrained pine resin, but had held her own with an impossible gentleness. He had been a shipwright, a man who understood the forces of water and wind, who could shape a hull to cleave the waves and stand against a gale. He had taught her that the world was a series of problems to be solved with patience, skill, and the right tool. She did not cry. She did not plead. The grief for her mother was a vast, cold ocean inside her, and this final act of administrative cruelty was merely a stone dropped into its depths, vanishing without a ripple. The house had ceased to be a home the day her mother married this man. It had become a museum of a life that was over, its spirit slowly suffocating under new carpets and fashionable paint colors. Alara had retreated to the workshop, the one place her stepfather avoided, the place that still smelled of sawdust, linseed oil, and her grandfather's pipe tobacco. There, among the ordered ranks of saws, planes, and chisels, she had kept his legacy alive. She learned the language of the dovetail saw, the whisper of the block plane over maple, the satisfying thud of a mortise and tenon joint seating perfectly. He had taught her that competence was a form of prayer, that to do a job well was to honor the materials and the purpose for which they were intended. Her hands were not soft. They were capable. They knew how to measure, to cut, to join, to build. She turned from her stepfather, walked past him without a word, and went to her room. It was small, spare, and already felt like it belonged to a stranger. She packed a single canvas satchel, a change of clothes, a wedge of hard cheese and a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, a small tin of her grandfather's special polish for brass and steel, and from a velvet-lined wooden box, she took the one object that was the heart of her inheritance. It was not a jewel or a bond, but a tool, a heavy brass vernier caliper, its slide moving with the silent, oiled precision of a fine watch. Its scales, etched with impossibly fine lines, could measure to 1,000th of an inch. Her grandfather had called it his truth-teller. "Measure twice, cut once," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "But measure with this, and you only need to measure once. It doesn't lie." She slid the caliper into a purpose-made leather sleeve and placed it in her bag. Then she walked to the workshop, her footsteps echoing in the suddenly cavernous house. She ran her hand over the scarred top of the workbench, a silent goodbye to the ghosts of 1,000 projects, of lessons learned and skills mastered. Finally, she walked back to the hall table, picked up the thin envelope her stepfather had left, and walked out the front door, closing it softly behind her. She did not look back. The $4 inside the envelope felt like both an insult and a liberation. She walked for 3 days. The road unspooled before her, a ribbon of dust winding through rolling hills that slowly sharpened into the hard granite shoulders of the mountains. The landscape grew harsher, the trees more sparse and wind-battered. The solitude was a balm. The rhythmic crunch of her boots on the gravel was a metronome for her thoughts, which were not of what she had lost, but of what she had to do next. Survive. It was a practical problem, the kind her grandfather would have appreciated. The grief was a passenger she carried, heavy and silent, but it did not steer. She did. On the evening of the third day, she arrived in the town of Absolution. It was a place clinging to the side of a mountain by its fingernails, a former mining boom town now caught in a long, slow bust. The grand stone facades of its main street were crumbling, their windows boarded over like blind eyes. A cold wind, sharp with the scent of pine and crushed stone, funneled down the canyon, carrying with it a sense of profound and settled decay. It was a place where things ended. For Alara, it felt like a place where she might begin, unnoticed. She found a room in a boarding house run by a weary-eyed woman who asked no questions and took 2 of Alara's $4 for a week's rent on a cot in a clean, cold room. The next morning, nursing a mug of thin, bitter coffee in the town's only diner, she listened. In a place this small, listening was a form of reconnaissance. She heard talk of the failing timber lease, of the low price of ore, of families packing up and moving on. Then she heard a conversation that snagged her attention. 2 old men in worn flannel were talking at the counter, their voices raspy with age. "Heard the county's finally putting the old Thorne place up for tax auction," one said. "That ruin?" the other scoffed. "They'd have to pay someone to take it. Place is cursed. Thorne died in there, you know. Just sat down at his bench and his heart gave out. Found him a week later." "Still," the first man said, "it was a gunsmith shop, a proper one. Thorne was an artist. Shame to see it fall in on itself. An artist who never spoke a word to nobody for 20 years. Place is full of bad memories and rust. Worthless. Worthless." The word echoed in Alara's mind, resonating with the $4 in her pocket. A gunsmith shop, a place of precision, of steel and wood, of fire and mechanics, a place of competence, a flicker of something that was not quite hope, but a grim, determined resolve kindled in her chest. She finished her coffee, stood up, and walked to the county clerk's office at the end of the street. The clerk was a man named Miller, a man whose frame seemed to be slowly collapsing into the worn leather of his chair. He had a perpetually amused, cynical expression, as if the town's decline were a private joke he alone appreciated. When Alara inquired about the Thorne property, his smile widened. "The old gunsmith's folly?" he chuckled, leaning back. "Honey, you don't want that. The roof's gone in the back, the forge is cracked, and folks say his ghost still bangs around in there at night." "Is it for sale?" Alara asked, her voice even. "Tax auction," he confirmed, pulling a dusty ledger towards him. "Minimum bid is 2 years back taxes. Comes to $4. He looked at her, the amusement in his eyes turning to outright mockery. "You got $4, little lady?" Alara reached into her pocket and placed her remaining $2 coins on the worn wooden counter. They made a small, definitive sound in the quiet office. "I do," she said. The clerk stared at the coins, then at her face. The joke, it seemed, was on him. He sighed, a long, theatrical exhalation of bureaucratic boredom. He stamped a few papers with a heavy, final-sounding thud, took her money and slid a folded deed across the counter. "Sold," he said, as if disposing of a piece of trash. "Lot 17, North Canyon Road. Keys with the blacksmith, Silas. Not that you'll need it. The back door fell off its hinges a decade ago." Alara took the deed, folded it carefully, and placed it in her satchel next to the leather-wrapped caliper. She felt the weight of the paper, the legal fact of it. She owned something. A ruin, a folly, a cursed place full of rust and bad memories. But it was hers. She walked out of the clerk's office and into the thin mountain sunlight. She did not go to the blacksmith for the key. She walked toward North Canyon Road, toward toward the edge of town where the last few houses gave way to scree and ponderosa pine. The shop was set back from the road, half swallowed by the encroaching wilderness. It was worse than she had imagined. The clerk had not been exaggerating. The building was a long, low structure of native stone and heavy timber, but it sagged in the middle as if its spine had been broken. The slate roof had shed tiles like broken teeth, and a large section over the rear had collapsed entirely, leaving a gaping wound open to the sky. The windows were shattered, the door hung ajar, and a thick pelt of moss and climbing vines was slowly digesting the stonework. For a long, heart-stopping moment, despair washed over her. The $4 felt like the most foolish sum ever spent. She had traded her last vestiges of security for a pile of stones that was actively trying to return to the earth. She took a deep breath, the air cold and damp, thick with the smell of wet rot, rust, and old, dead things. Then she squared her shoulders. Her grandfather had never looked at a damaged ship and seen only a wreck. He had seen the sound timbers, the salvageable keel, the lines that could be restored. Alara walked slowly around the perimeter, her eyes scanning not for the decay, but for the strength. The foundation, she noted, was massive, built of huge granite blocks, expertly fitted together. The front section of the shop, where the walls were thickest, seemed mostly intact. The main roof beam, a colossal piece of old-growth fir, was weathered but straight and true. The structure had good bones. It was a problem to be solved. She pushed open the groaning front door and stepped inside. A cathedral of dust and decay greeted her. Shafts of light from the broken windows pierced the gloom, illuminating swirling motes of dust and casting long shadows from the silent, shrouded machinery. A fine layer of gray grit covered everything, softening the hard edges of workbenches, vices, and the hulking shape of the forge in the corner. It smelled of cold soot, damp earth, and the metallic tang of rust. Her first task was shelter. The collapsed rear of the building was a lost cause for now, a jumble of splintered rafters and broken slate. But the front room, the smith's main workshop, was protected by the still-sound roof. She found a corner away from the draftiest window, swept away the thickest layers of debris with a broken piece of board, and laid out her bedroll. This would be her fortress. This small 10 by 10 foot square of stone floor was the beginning of her new world. For the next week, she worked from dawn until dusk. It was a cleansing ritual, a battle waged with a broom made from a pine branch and a shovel she found in the rubble. She swept out decades of accumulated dust, dirt, and the nests of forgotten animals. She hauled out broken furniture and heaps of rusted, unidentifiable metal parts. With each barrow load of debris she wheeled out into the sunlight, the shop seemed to breathe a little easier. The space began to reveal itself, to show its true form. The layout was simple and practical. The front room was the main workspace, dominated by the massive stone forge and a long, heavy workbench that ran the length of the west wall. Behind it was the storeroom, now a ruin. A small, partitioned-off area near the front door had clearly been the showroom, with a shattered glass display case and empty gun racks on the wall. As she worked, she felt a growing sense of kinship with the man who had built this place. Every detail spoke of purpose and forethought. The floor sloped gently toward a drain near the quenching tub. The forge was positioned to catch the best cross breeze from the windows. This was the sanctuary of a master craftsman. It was during the cleaning of the main workbench that she found it. The bench was a marvel, its top made from a single 4-inch thick slab of maple, scarred and burned from years of use. It was bolted directly into the stone wall. As she wiped away the grime, she noticed something odd. The bench was supported by 4 massive timber legs, but against the wall, near the right-hand end, was a 5th support that was not a leg. It was a metal column, a heavy cast-iron cylinder. While the rest of the metal in the shop was coated in a deep layer of orange rust, this column showed only a faint patina. It had been protected, or it was made of a different alloy. Curious, she knelt and ran her hand over it. It was cool and smooth. She tapped it. It rang with a dull, solid thud, not the hollow sound she expected. Her eyes traced its path from the floor to the underside of the workbench. There she saw the anomaly. The heavy bolts securing the benchtop to its frame were all identical, thick, hand-forged hexagonal bolts, all except one. Directly above the iron column was a single, perfectly machined, round-headed bolt with a slotted drive, like something from a fine clock or scientific instrument. It was made of brass, and it gleamed faintly in the dusty light. Her heart began to beat a little faster. It was an inconsistency, a deliberate break in the pattern. It was a secret. She thought of her grandfather's caliper, the truth-teller. She retrieved it from her satchel, the cool, heavy brass a familiar comfort in her hand. She knelt again, her fingers gently wiping the dust from the strange bolt head. Using the caliper's depth rod, she measured the depth of the slot. Then she measured the diameter of the head. She compared it to the other bolts. It was different in every dimension, but by precise, deliberate increments. This was not a repair. It was a keyhole. She had no screwdriver that would fit such a large, unusual slot. But her grandfather had taught her more than just woodworking. He had taught her improvisation. In a pile of scrap, she found a flat bar of spring steel. She took it to the one solid part of the forge's anvil, and with a heavy ball-peen hammer she'd uncovered, she began the slow, careful process of shaping the end of the bar. It was clumsy work without a hot fire, but she was patient. She hammered, she checked the fit, she filed it with a rusty file she'd spent an hour cleaning and sharpening. She worked until the tip of the steel bar was a perfect mate for the slot in the brass bolt. With the makeshift key seated, she tried to turn it. It wouldn't budge. It was frozen by time, or locked internally. She didn't force it. She remembered another lesson. Her grandfather, working on a seized brass fitting on an old ship's compass, had never used brute force. He used persuasion. Alara took the small tin of her grandfather's polish, a mixture of fine oil, beeswax, and a solvent whose secret he had taken to his grave, and worked a small amount into the seam around the bolt head. She tapped it gently, letting the vibration draw the oil into the hidden threads. She waited an hour. She did it again. On the third try, as the evening light turned the dusty air in the workshop to gold, she put the tool in the slot, braced herself, and applied steady, even pressure. For a moment, nothing. Then, with a groan that seemed to come from the very bones of the building, the bolt turned. It moved with a smooth, mechanical resistance, not the grating of rust. She turned it a full 360 degrees, and then she heard it, a low, heavy clunk from within the iron column below. Her breath caught in her throat. She pulled on the column. It did not move. She pushed it. Nothing. She examined the point where it met the stone floor. The fit was perfect, seamless. But now that she was looking, she saw the faintest of scribe lines in the flagstone, a perfect circle around the column's base. Using the edge of her steel bar, she pried carefully at the line. A section of the flagstone lifted. It was not a stone, but a stone lid, its underside hollowed out to fit over a mechanism. Beneath it was not a lock, but a simple, heavy iron ring. With her heart pounding against her ribs, she hooked her fingers through the ring and pulled. The entire iron column, which she now realized was a massive, cylindrical piston, began to retract into the floor with a hiss of displaced air. As it descended, a section of the massive maple workbench above it, about 2 feet square, lowered with it, revealing a dark, square cavity cut into the heart of the bench itself. The air that rose from the opening was cool and dry, smelling not of rot, but of old paper, oiled leather, and something else. A faint, clean, metallic scent. She reached for the lantern she had bought at the general store and, with trembling hands, lit the wick. She lowered the light into the cavity. The lantern light fell upon a small wooden chest, bound in iron straps. It was not locked. Beside it, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a leather-bound book. It was a gunsmith's ledger, its cover stamped with a single, elegant name, Elias Thorne. Alara lifted the chest first. It was heavier than it looked, far heavier. She set it on the floor and slowly, reverently, lifted the lid. The lantern light shattered into 1,000 tiny suns. The chest was filled to the brim with gold coins. Not a pirate's hoard of random doubloons, but neat, orderly stacks of American eagles and double eagles, their minted surfaces gleaming as if they had been struck yesterday. It was a fortune, a lifetime of quiet, methodical, solitary work, translated into pure, incorruptible value. It was enough money to rebuild this shop 10 times over, to build a new life from the ashes of the old. For a long time, she could only stare, her mind unable to process the scale of it. It was an impossibility, a fairy tale. But the weight of a single coin in her palm was undeniably real. After the initial shock subsided, she closed the chest and turned her attention to the book. This, she knew, was the real treasure. The gold was a means, but the book was a message. She sat on the cold stone floor, the lantern beside her casting a warm pool of light, and opened the ledger. The first few pages were records of work, a custom rifle for a trapper, a set of dueling pistols for a wealthy man from the city, a delicate repair on a lady's pocket pistol. The handwriting was a work of art in itself, a precise, elegant script. But then, about a third of the way through, the entries changed. The dates stopped, and the script became a journal. "They have taken it all," the first entry read. "My partner, the man I trusted as a brother, has absconded with the company funds, my patents, and my good name. He has left me with debts and accusations of fraud. The law is on his side. His lies are more convincing than my truth. I have been ruined. I came to this remote place to escape the whispers and the pity, to build a new life from what little I had left, my hands and my knowledge." Alara felt a profound and aching kinship with this ghost. His story of betrayal, of being cast out and left with nothing but his skills, was a mirror of her own. She read on, devouring his words. He wrote of building the shop, of finding solace in the uncompromising logic of steel and fire. He wrote of his customers, the mountain men and prospectors who judged him not by his past, but by the quality of his work. They paid him in cash and gold dust, and he, trusting no bank or partner ever again, began to hide it. "I have devised a small security," he wrote, describing the mechanism under the bench with quiet pride. "A simple thing, but it will keep my earnings safe from thieves and fools. It will open only for one who understands that the answer is not always found in brute force, but in careful observation." The final entry was dated 20 years after the first. The handwriting was slightly less steady, but just as elegant. "I am old now. The fire in the forge burns lower, as does the one in my heart. I have no wife, no child to whom I can leave the fruits of my long labor. This place has been my only companion. The gold in the chest is a burden. It is the result of my work, but it is not the meaning of it. The meaning is in the work itself, the pursuit of perfection, the quiet satisfaction of a thing well made." He continued, "If you are reading this, it means you have found my secret. It means you have the mind of a craftsman. You have looked, you have measured, you have thought. You have not simply smashed. For this I am grateful. The gold is yours. Use it not for a life of ease, but for a life of purpose. This shop has been a fortress for my solitude. Let it now be a foundation for your future. Do not let it fall to ruin. Bring the forge back to life. Make things of worth and beauty. That is all the thanks I ask. Live a good life here. Find the peace that I found in the work, but do not make my mistake. Do not let it be your only companion." Tears, hot and sudden, fell onto the brittle page. She was not crying for her own loss, but for his, for the profound loneliness of this man who had turned his pain into beauty and precision. who had left a blessing for a stranger he would never meet. She was no longer just the owner of a ruin. She was the steward of a legacy. She closed the book, her hand resting on the worn leather. She did not cry. She did not plead. She did not run. She began to work. With the predecessor's blessing in her heart and his fortune secured, Ilara's despair was replaced by a quiet, formidable determination. The gold was a tool, nothing more. The true inheritance was the purpose he had given her. First, she secured the shop. From the nearby town of Crestwood, a larger, more prosperous logging center, she ordered lumber, slate tiles, and glass. She did not flash the gold. She paid with a few coins at a time, drawing no more attention than a homesteader with a lucky strike. The work was her entire world. She rose before the sun, her breath pluming in the cold mountain air, and worked until her muscles screamed and darkness forced her to stop. She started with the roof. Using a block and tackle of her own devising, she hoisted new beams into place, her grandfather's lessons on leverage and mechanical advantage echoing in her mind. She learned the craft of the slater, setting the new tiles in overlapping rows, each one nailed down with copper nails that would not rust. The rhythmic tap-tap-tap of her hammer became a new sound in the canyon, a counterpoint to the whisper of the wind. Her work did not go unnoticed. The first to approach was Silas, the town blacksmith. He was a mountain of a man with a beard like scorched iron filings and arms as thick as fence posts. He stomped up to the shop one afternoon, his expression a thunderous scowl. He had heard the hammering. He had come to see what fool was wasting their time on Thorn's Folly. He found Ilara perched on the roof ridge, expertly setting the final capstones. He watched her for 10 minutes, his arms crossed, saying nothing. He noted the straight lines, the tight joints, the confident economy of her movements. "You handle a hammer like you mean it," he grunted when she finally climbed down, her face smudged with dirt. It was the highest form of praise. "My grandfather taught me," she said simply. "The forge is cracked," he stated, gesturing with his chin toward the shop. "Fire clay and iron strapping. I have both. I'll bring them by tomorrow. You'll need a strong back to help with the strapping." "What do I owe you?" Ilara asked. "The south bellows has a tear in the leather," he said, not looking at her. "Thorn had a way with fine stitching. If you've got his hands, you can fix it. We'll call it even." It was not charity. It was a transaction between professionals. It was the first crack in her wall of solitude. The next to arrive was Jebediah, an old trapper who lived so far up the canyon he was considered more a part of the landscape than a resident of the town. He was thin and weathered as an old piece of leather, his eyes the pale, far-seeing blue of the mountain sky. He brought her a string of freshly caught trout. "Saw your smoke," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "Thorn was a good man. Quiet. Made me a rifle 40 years ago. Still shoots truer than any other. He'd be glad someone's waking the place up." He told her stories of the gunsmith, of his quiet integrity, filling in the gaps in the journal. He showed her which plants were good for medicine and which roots were good to eat. He offered his knowledge of the mountains as freely as she offered him a cup of hot coffee brewed over her small fire. Then came Martha, who ran the town's general store, a practical, broad-shouldered woman who had seen the town through its boom and its bust. She extended Ilara a line of credit without being asked. "I know good stock when I see it," she said, her gaze firm and appraising. "You're a worker. Pay me when you can." She brought supplies, news from the town, and a quiet, maternal warmth that Ilara hadn't realized she had been starving for. With Silas's help, she repaired the great forge. They heated the iron straps until they glowed cherry red and wrapped them around the firebox, the metal contracting as it cooled, pulling the cracked stones together with immense force. When she finally lit the first fire, feeding it with coal and pumping the newly repaired bellows, the roar of the air and the hungry crackle of the flames was the sound of a heart starting to beat again. The shop was coming alive. She spent weeks restoring Thorne's tools. She soaked rusted files in vinegar, painstakingly cleaning between each tooth. She reground the edges of chisels and planes on a whetstone. She disassembled the lathes and drill presses, cleaning and oiling each gear and bearing, using her grandfather's brass caliper to check for wear and fabricate new bushings where needed. It was methodical, devotional work. She was not just cleaning tools. She was reawakening a dormant skill, connecting her own hands to the hands of the man who had used them before her. One day, Miller, the town clerk, walked by. He was on his way to fish, a pastime that occupied most of his days. He stopped, staring in disbelief at the transformed building. The new roof gleamed in the sun, glass shone in the windows, and a steady plume of smoke rose from the stone chimney. Alara was at the doorway, planing the edge of a new oak door she had built, the shavings curling at her feet like golden ringlets. He saw the clean, ordered workshop behind her, the glow of the forge, the glint of restored tools on the walls. His mocking smile was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed astonishment. He simply shook his head and walked on, his fishing pole seeming a flimsy, foolish thing in the face of such tangible, productive labor. His silent defeat was more satisfying than any argument could ever have been. The winter came early and hard, a brutal siege of snow and ice. A blizzard descended from the high peaks, burying the town in a matter of hours. The wind howled down the canyon, a physical force that tore at roofs and shattered windows. The power lines, flimsy and poorly maintained, snapped, plunging Absolution into darkness and cold. But Alara's shop stood firm. Her new roof held. The stones her grandfather would have approved of did not yield, and the windows she had so carefully glazed did not shudder. The forge, banked with coal, filled the workshop with a deep, steady warmth. Her small fortress was an island of light and heat in the frozen dark. During a brief lull in the storm, a frantic pounding came at her new door. It was Martha, her face pale with worry. A family of homesteaders, the McGregors, had been caught on the road. Their wagon had broken an axle, and they were stranded a mile out of town with 2 small children. The men who had tried to reach them had been driven back by the wind and the deepening drifts. "The axle is cast iron," Martha said, her breath fogging in the cold. "It snapped clean. Silas's forge is cold. The power is out. He can't run his blower." Alara looked at her own forge, at the deep, glowing heart of the coals. Her bellows were hand-pumped. Her power came from her own 2 arms. "Bring it here," she said. 2 men hauled the heavy, broken axle into the shop, their faces grim. It looked hopeless. But Alara examined the clean, crystalline break. She saw the solution. It was a problem of joining, of fire and force. She fired up the forge, the roar of the bellows filling the stone room. She used techniques she had only read about in Thorne's old books, creating a V-shaped scarf on each broken end. With Silas, who had followed the axle to her door, shouting instructions and encouragement over the roar, she brought the 2 ends to a bright, welding heat. The moment came. She and Silas pulled the glowing pieces from the fire, laid them on the anvil, and with a sequence of powerful, coordinated hammer blows, drove them together. Sparks erupted in a brilliant shower, illuminating the determined faces around the anvil. It was a forge weld, an ancient and difficult technique. They worked the hot iron, hammering, shaping, reinforcing, their 2 hammers rising and falling in a rhythmic, percussive duet. When it was done, the axle was whole again, the seam a barely visible line. It was stronger than it had been before. While it cooled, Alara welcomed the McGregor family into the warmth of the shop. She gave the shivering children hot broth and wrapped them in blankets by the fire. Her workshop, once a bastion of solitude, had become a sanctuary for the community. She had not just repaired a piece of metal. She had used her skills, her inheritance of competence, to serve others, to forge a bond of mutual reliance and respect that was stronger than any iron. The storm broke. The axle was fitted. The family was safe. Alara had asked for nothing in return, but the next day Mr. McGregor left a cord of perfectly split and seasoned firewood outside her door. Martha left a basket of canned goods. Silas left a new, perfectly balanced hammer on her workbench. They were offerings of respect. She was no longer an outsider. She was a part of absolution. In the quiet spring that followed, she fulfilled her final promise to Elias Thorne. In his journal, he had described a final project he never had the heart to finish. A plains rifle of exceptional grace and accuracy, intended as a gift for a friend he had lost touch with. The stock, carved from a piece of striped tiger maple, was in a chest upstairs. The barrel, forged and rifled with painstaking care, was wrapped in oiled cloth. Alara took up the work. She spent a month finishing the rifle. She polished the barrel until it shone with a deep, black luster. She carved the final details into the maple stock, her small chisels moving with practiced grace. She fitted the lock mechanism, each part honed and polished until the action was as smooth as glass. When it was finished, it was not just a weapon, but a work of art, a perfect union of wood and steel, form and function. It felt warm and alive in her hands. She did not sell it. One evening, she walked up the canyon to Jebediah's cabin and gave it to him. The old trapper took the rifle with a reverence that bordered on awe. He ran his hand over the smooth stock, his thumb tracing the elegant lines. "This is Thorne's work," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It has his soul in it. And yours." Years passed. The gunsmith's shop became the heart of the town's resilience. Alara did not just repair firearms. She repaired the tools and machines that kept the struggling town alive. She was a mender, a builder, a quiet pillar of competence in a world that often felt like it was falling apart. The community, drawn to her steady strength, began to rebuild around her. New families moved in, not for a boom, but for a life of substance, drawn by the spirit of the place she had rekindled. One quiet summer evening, Alara stood at her workbench, the last rays of the sun filtering through the clean windows of her workshop. The air was rich with the familiar, comforting smells of sawdust, hot metal, and oiled steel. On the bench before her, her grandfather's heavy brass caliper lay next to a small, intricate music box she had just finished, its tiny gears and levers a testament to the skills she had honed. They were her two inheritances, the tool of truth from the man who taught her how to work, and the legacy of purpose from the man who taught her what to work for. She looked around the shop, no longer a ruin, but a thriving, warm, and living place. She thought of the cold, dismissive face of her stepfather, of the $4 that had been meant as a final insult. It was a paltry sum, meant to cast her out into nothingness, but it had bought her everything. It had bought her a home, a purpose, a community, and a profound, quiet peace that settled deep in her bones. The $4 she had paid to a mocking clerk for a pile of worthless rubble was, without a doubt, the best money she had ever spent.